Good afternoon, everybody. Just realised that I was still muted, so I do apologise if I looked like I was getting to get started and then I stopped. Today's back to our Friday webinar. Today is Friday the 28th of August. Can you believe it? We are at the bank holiday weekend, and I hope many of you have got some great plans to get some rest and relaxation over the weekend. Before I start today's webinar, I would really like to, first of all, I'd like to apologise to anybody who may have got caught up in the unsavoury comments that we have received in response to today's webinar. Sadly, the topic for today touches on some very sensitive issues, and in particular we have caused quite a bit of upset for a face group of British Airways employees, and you may have seen in the news recently that British Airways has announced 12,000 job losses. As part of that process, they have also talked about cutting wages through a variation of terms. And in an attempt to drive down staffing costs. And unfortunately, our topic for this webinar today very much touched on those issues. And it has provoked a very wide response, which was sadly shared with a wider audience. So first of all, if this has impacted you, I am deeply sorry. It was never my intention to cause any upset or cause any issues. As you know, for those of you who regularly join our webinars, is that my support is always to business owners to help them with the survival of their businesses, particularly during these very challenging times, and wherever possible to save jobs. It's certainly not my intention to provoke or to entice business owners to cut jobs so there are job losses. Certainly I'm here to help you, to guide you through this these difficult situations. I'd hoped to provide a solution for many businesses in today's webinar, particularly if you find yourself in those really difficult financial situations where you're struggling to meet your financial responsibilities towards your staff. I'm hoping to provide a solution as an alternative to cutting costs. Of course it is to cut costs, but as an alternative to cutting staff and to avoiding redundancy. So really, that's really where I was coming from this. As I've said, it was never ever my intention to upset any individuals, and I'm sad, deeply saddened that this has actually caused the impact that it has, that people have misinterpreted what I was going to be talking about today. We all know that the UK is facing an economic crisis. We are facing a recession like we have never seen before. I do understand that this is very challenging and difficult times for businesses and individuals alike. I genuinely do not underestimate the seriousness of everything that is going on. So I do, if this has affected anybody, I would warmly welcome you to give me a call. Let's have a chat about it. I would really like to have a friendly chat to discuss this further. Hopefully, my apology goes a long way. It certainly, as I have said, has not been my intention to upset anybody. So looking at today's webinar, we are looking at changing terms of employment. We are looking at variation of terms and how that can, you can use that within your organisation. As I say, I'm Angela Clay from HR for UK, and today is Friday the 28th of August. And the time has just gone 3 o'clock. So many of you who perhaps are not familiar with us, who are HR for UK? We are a leading provider of HR services, of HR and employment law, payroll and health and safety services to small businesses throughout the UK. We've got over 30 years of experience, and we have got some 5-star rate reviews. I would really encourage everybody to go and have a look at our website. Go and read those 5-star reviews for yourself to see how we have been able to help businesses, and make a decision for yourself on how we have performed. Read those reviews. It's what clients say about us, and I'm very proud of what we have been able to achieve, particularly over the last few months in these difficult situations. So a little bit about myself. I'm an employment law and HR and employment law solicitor, and I am the Managing Director of HR for UK, and I am responsible for HR for UK's role as a leading professional HR services to help UK businesses across the nation. My vision has been and always will be is to ensure that your business successfully comes out of this coronavirus crisis. We've now been, it's been at the heart of many businesses for over 6 months now, and we are now starting to come out of it. And my vision is to make sure that businesses continue to come out. And the way that I do that is to provide you with clear, practical advice and, of course, that ongoing support. So what are we going to cover today? So my Friday webinars would not be a Friday webinar without a brief update on the furlough scheme. I'm going to have a look at when you can change an employee's terms of employment. I'm going to talk about how you go about changing terms. I'm also going to talk very briefly about what to do when an employee refuses to agree to those changes. And finally, I'm going to have a look at what are the risks and the potential pitfalls. And I'm going to have a look at some case studies. And hopefully, when we get to the end of this, you will be armed and a little bit more informed on how is best practice it is to go about attending to a variation of terms, and of course to try and keep you out of the limelight of potentially upsetting employees and becoming embroiled in a campaign, a hate campaign against individuals who are trying to help make sure that their businesses survive. So usually I have the chat box open, and I normally welcome everybody to have provide me with live Q&As, but in order to protect everybody, in today's webinar, I have actually closed the chat box. So if you are putting any questions in there, we will actually receive them, but we will not be dealing with them live today. Of course, you can always provide us with questions that you may have via our info@hrforuk.com website, or you can go to our website and fill out a contact us form there, and we will get in contact with you. I'm sure that many of you will understand that these measures have been put in place. As I say, it's not only to protect it's to protect everybody and to make the best out of this webinar, and without my distractions being taken somewhere else where I try and field through different questions that may be coming through, some of them which perhaps may not be appropriate. But of course, video recording will be sent to everybody on this webinar, so we will send copies to you. It will be made available and you will be able to watch this in your own time. As I say, I'm afraid today there won't be any live Q&As, but of course we will pull some questions together that will come through, and we will make sure that you are not shortchanged in relation to any questions that you may have. So let's have a move on today. So as I said really early on, many businesses are still in that transition stage, grappling with the effects of COVID-19 and how they are going to operate, once the coronavirus job retention scheme comes to an end at the end of October. Some businesses have already started to do things differently and have started to, get their workforce in on a rotation basis. Some organisations have already introduced return to work on a shift pattern, and they have introduced measures that are COVID-19 measures to help prevent the spread of the virus. Certainly the government has announced that they are really encouraging employees to go back to the workplace, particularly once schools go back to, children go back to schools next week once they start opening. And they are actively encouraging that employees do go back to the workplace. I do apologise, I'm just going to have a little cough, so I apologise. Apologies. The government is encouraging businesses to start getting their workforce back in and trying to go back to normal, particularly when schools open next week, where there is not the issue of childcare issues and businesses can start having employees come back into the workplace. And as I've already said, you know, some of these changes may not be fundamental changes. They may not necessarily be a change to pay, a change to hours. It may simply be a change to way your business is running in comparison to how it used to run pre-COVID-19. So it may be introducing shift patterns. It may be introducing a more flexible approach to home working and office working. You know, a lot of businesses have really found that home working really works for them, and that this may be one of the changes that they want to be introducing when they are talking about a variation of terms. So again, you know, these are there are going to be changes. An employer must not simply push those changes through. You cannot make a change to an employee's terms of employment unilaterally. You must get their consent to be able to do that before you do it. And if you don't get the employee's consent, you have to be mindful of what options are available to you. And I will have a talk about those today, so as you can see what options are there, and also from an employee's point of view on how they will be able to deal with that. So today's webinar, as I say, I'm going to be talking about what actions you need to be taking. I'm going to be talking about how to be mindful of pitfalls and how you can avoid those and avoid by disengaging your employees while you are going through that process, because employee engagement is so important to the success of any business. So as I said, briefly, I'm going to go through a furlough update. And I'm going to talk about when you can change an employee's terms of employment, how you go about it, what to do when an employee refuses, and what are the risks to employers. So let's turn to our furlough update. So we are at the end of August, and we are now well into the flexible furlough scheme. From Tuesday, we have our next step change in the impact that this is going to be having on organisations. So from Tuesday, the government level of support is going to drop down to 70%. So they will be covering 70% of an employee's wages for their furlough hours, and there is an expectation that employers will pick up the additional 10%. This means that the employees will always receive 80% of their wages for their furloughed hours. Of course, if an employee is working flexibly under the flexible furlough scheme, they will receive their normal pay, their full pay for the hours that they actually work. Employers will now, of course, continue be required to pay the national insurance contributions, and they will also be required to pay the auto-enrolment contributions. The cap on the level of claim will drop in accordance with the level of support that's been provided, and that cap will reduce from £2,500, it will reduce to £2,190. So that is the maximum amount you will be able to claim furlough hours for an employee who has previously been furloughed under the scheme. The Kickstart scheme, I genuinely thought we'd have some guidance on this. We just as a quick reminder, the Kickstart scheme is open to all UK businesses, which is a new fund of £2 billion. Which will cover 100% of wages of minimum wage costs for 25 hours a week for 16 to 24-year-olds. We still, as I said, we still don't have any guidance on that, so we don't know how it's actually going to work, how employers can actually put job roles out there, and how you can actually get the candidates to come and work for your organisation. So, you know, again, watch this space. As soon as we do have information on that, we will provide it to you. The government did say when they introduced this that it would be in the autumn. I don't know whether we consider the 1st of September as the beginning of autumn or whether we consider it later in the month, but certainly we do anticipate this to come out in the very near future. And as I said, as soon as it does come out, I will make sure that you are made aware of it. Some other also good news that has come out in the week in relation to quarantine with employees who have to quarantine once they've come perhaps from an area that has now been taken off of the travel corridor. We are seeing almost weekly where countries are added to that list. We now know that employees who are on low wages will be entitled to £13 a week if they are, sorry, it's £13 a day if they are required to quarantine. So that quarantine period is for 14 days So for those employees who are on low wages, they will be entitled to £13 a day if they are required to quarantine. And this is an impact of not only from the travel ban, but also if you have to quarantine in relation to the track and trace. So if you've been caught up in an area where you have been identified through the track and trace, this will be available. Again, this has only recently been announced. We're not sure where employers will be able to have access to those funds, whether it will be done through the universal credit and given directly to the employees, or whether it will come through the PAYE payroll, or whether employees will have to claim for it separately through the portal. But again, as always, as soon as I know more information, I will share this with you, so you can make sure that those who are entitled to it can get that all-important additional finances to help them through this very difficult time. So we move on. I've already taken up 15 minutes of today's webinar. I can assure you I will probably take up the full 45 minutes in going through what we are going to talk today. So let's have a look at when can you change employment terms of an employee. So an employer can only make a change if the contract allows it. And there has to be something specific in the contract of employment, terms of employment, your written statement of terms, they all mean the same thing, which has a variation clause. If a contract does not have a variation clause, you cannot vary that contract. A variation of clause is also known as a flexibility clause, and it does normally sit as a standalone clause on its own. You can make a change to an employee's contract if the employee agrees to that change. So that may come about if they have come to you to make a change to their terms of employment, or if there is a trade union and it has been agreed by employee reps or a trade union rep. An employer can force a new contract on employee, but that absolutely has to be the last resort, because if you are going to force it onto an employee, it may give rise to legal action, and I am going to cover that a little bit more a little bit later. But if the proposed change is covered in the contract of employment, or the contract of employment allows that, you can bring those changes through. So I can hear you already thinking, you can make changes, you can't make changes. So it will really depend on what the changes you want to make will depend whether you can or can't do it. But of course, if there is anything in the employee's contract of employment that has specific variation of terms, so for example, your hours, your working days, rates of pay, your place of work, you would normally find specific provisions in a contract of employment that will make a process that you can follow for that particular change that you want to make. So this is legally known, as I said, a variation clause or a flexibility clause. So where would you have a look, and how would you check to see whether you've got that flexibility clause in your contract? So check the flexibility clause. Check the wording, because it may be potted around the contract of employment in various places. So check to see that the employer can specifically make those changes, and also check to see what notice you have to give an employee when various changes are made. And if there is a change that is going to be made, you should have a look in the contract to see if there is a certain process that you have to make, a certain process that you have to follow before you can make those changes. So it's really, really important to have a look at the employee terms of employment, have a look at those written statement of terms, those contracts of employment, to see what it says that you can do before you can go about it. So when checking the clause, make sure that there is the flexibility clause. Make sure that the clause itself is clear and specific, and it's very clear and specific about what can be changed. It's not open for an employer just to go and make any changes. Do look at the contract, because that will give you a guide as to what you need to do when you are trying to make those specific changes. So, for example, an employer might be considering a change of an employee's place of work. The place of work might have a flexibility clause in the location or place of work section of the employment contract. And the wording of the contract might be something along the lines is that the employee can work anywhere in the UK, or the employer may change the place of work without the need to consult. Now, even though there is the words that it might be without the need to consult, we will always advise you to consult with your employees with a variation of terms, whether there is a statutory requirement for you to do so, or whether it is just whether it's a fundamental change or whether it is a minor change. We would always encourage you to consult with your employees, get their engagement, get them on board, and it will make the process so much easier. So when you are consulting on employees when there is a flexibility clause in the contract, it's always, as I've said, a good idea for you to talk to your employees before you decide to make that change. The consultation must be before any changes are made, because if the consultation takes place after you've made those changes, it's too late and you've already exposed yourself to potential claims. So it's really important, like I've discussed on so many of these webinars before, get your staff on board as early on as possible, because the more information you share with them about why you need to do something and how you're going to go about it, the more likely you are going to engage with them, you are going to hear their side of the story, and you are going to be able to achieve what works for both parties. So, always, talk to your employees before making a decision. And as I say, talking to your employees from the start has a lot of benefits, because it'll help implement the change, and it works for both the employer and the employee. Now, what happens if there isn't a clause in the contract? So if there is no flexibility clause or a variation clause, or there is the provision within a particular section which allows you to make the proposed changes, the employer and the employee must agree to those changes before it is implemented. So even if there is a contract provision that allows you to do it, you need to discuss it. But it is even more so important where that clause does not exist, because you need to agree that change before it is implemented. Employers cannot and should not unilaterally make any changes. It is about a journey, it's about a process, it's about finding that middle ground and agreeing a way forward. So open discussions with employees about changes to their contract will help, because it will help prevent potential disagreements and potential legal disputes that go with it. But more importantly, it will help employers and employees work more closely together once they've agreed those changes, because they're working towards the same end goal. So let's have a look at engaging with employees and consulting with them. So if you have to change a contract of employment, as I've said, and I'm going to sound like a stuck record, the very first step is to talk to your employees. If you recognise a trade union, you need to consult and talk with the trade union representatives. And likewise, if you have employee representatives, you need to talk and engage with them. Before you even start with the consultation process, it's a very good idea for employers to think about, why do you need to make this change? What you need to do to achieve by making this change. So again, it's having a look at the purpose behind the justification for making the change. And I'm going to have a look at that a little bit more in a little bit more depth later. But it's not something that should be taken lightly. A variation of terms is something that many businesses don't take lightly. It's very rare that you will find that an employer will just willy-nilly change an employee's terms and conditions of employment. But you do still need to be mindful on how you're going to do it. So do think about why you need to do it and what you need to achieve by making those changes. And sometimes the two interlink with each other. So during the consultation, it's a two-way process. It's not a one-way process. It is a two-way process where ideas are shared between the employer and the employee, and you work together in getting those ideas. So an employer, when you're starting to share those ideas, really have a look and share the rationale behind the decision to make the changes. Invite employees in to talk about their concerns that they may have, and actually put forward any suggested ideas that they may have as alternatives, because you'll be surprised how many employees will come up with an alternative idea which an employer has not thought about. And actually, sometimes when you think about it, it actually works for both. So listening to your employees' concerns and considering their ideas is really, really key to a variation of terms. And make sure that you do everything that you possibly can to resolve any concerns. Any employee concerns that do arise, don't just ignore them, don't disregard them, do take them seriously, do take them on board, and do give them a lot of due consideration. And I've talked about this so many times during my webinars. A lot of HR is process driven, but it's not necessarily just the process. Yes, it is absolutely key to get the process right, but the more important side of it is the journey that you go through with your employees while you are executing that process, and that's really, really key and important. So I've talked about having to consult with trade unions and employee representatives, so do have a look to see whether you have to do that. And again, that will be contained in the contract of employment, in the written statement of terms. It will be there, and it will be a clause, a standalone clause on its own. So consulting with trade unions or employee representatives can help you openly and honestly help you as an employer have meaningful conversations and discussions with employees. It will give you a better idea on employee concerns. Do remember that sometimes there is a legal obligation for you to consult. So again, if you recognize a trade union, you have that legal obligation. Similarly, if you have got large numbers, it's similar numbers to if you are going through a redundancy process. So if you are thinking that there may be a dismissal and a re-engagement of 20 or more employees, you have to go through a prescribed time frame and a prescribed process to implement those variation of terms. So again, it all comes back down to that planning, making sure that you plan right at the very beginning so that you know what you have to do, you know what you are dealing with. Because of course, if you get that wrong, not consulting in those time frames that you need to, could give rise to some hefty fines. So again, those fines can be quite significant, and you don't want to find yourself in that just simply by not checking the contracts to see whether you have to do that. Always consider alternatives. Alternatives are, a way forward, and by engaging and seeking, your employees' input will always help you with that. As I said, employees are quite creative when coming up with some solutions which you may not have thought of. And depending on the proposed changes, your employers, you might want to ask for volunteers. So you may not want to implement it across the entire workforce. You might ask for volunteers for a certain group of people that it might suit better, because certain changes might work better for certain employees as opposed to others. But without that consultation, without that open and honest discussion with employees, you won't establish that. So again, it's looking at your organization, it's looking at your employees and finding a way. It's about finding that middle ground. Offer employees incentives on how they can do it. Do bear in mind, incentives don't have to be pay related. An incentive could, for example, be extra time off or extra annual leave. It could be time off in lieu. It could be help with travel costs, for example, if you've had to change the location, if the employee has to travel further, if the variation of term is going to be about where they are going to be based in terms of carrying out their work. And take on employee ideas, see what they've got. They may even have some incentive ideas that you may not have thought about. So it may be that certain things could be offset against others. Do also bear in mind that if there has been a business transfer, so if the 2P regulations apply, a variation of terms becomes a lot more difficult. So again, you know, the whole purpose of the 2P regulations, so just a reminder, they are a transfer of undertaking protection of employment terms. So again, if an employee is protected because there has been a business transfer, you really have to think very hard before you want to carry out a variation of terms, because it is very complex, and it gets lots of businesses in trouble. So when an employee transfers, they do have some specific protections, and you know, employers need to be very mindful of that. So again, looking at it, if you are looking at making a variation of terms, go back and have a look to see whether the employee has perhaps been an employee that has been 2P'd into your organisation as part of a business transfer. So there's lots of things that you need to look out for. Again, trade union representatives. So again, if there is a trade union involved, they can agree the contract changes on behalf of their employees. So they can do that when it is written in the employee's contract of employment that the trade union can make those changes. This is called an incorporated term, or it's incorporated into the contract. If it's not, even if it's not written into the employee's terms of employment or their written statement of terms, the employer, if they recognise it and they have traditionally worked with trade unions to impose those changes, working with a trade union to get that, it may be resulting in an implied change of terms. So again, working with trade unions, it can be incorporated in different ways. So again, it's making sure that you know who you are dealing with when you are making these proposals for the variation of terms. So again, very important, make sure that you check for existing trade union agreements that may be in place. Because sometimes there may be an agreement between the employer and the employee, which is also known as a collective agreement, that says the trade union can agree changes for all employees. And don't forget that collective agreement can only be enforced if it is included in the contract of employment. So again, if you do recognise a trade union, do make sure that if there are any collective agreements, it is referred to in the contract of employment, because if it's not referred to in the contract of employment, it can't be relied on. So another question that often comes into me when we are dealing with employees, an employee does not have to be a member of a trade union for those changes to be agreed on their behalf. So again, an employee does not need to be a member of a trade union to agree the changes. Okay, so if the change is going to affect 20 or more employees, of course, if you've got trade union, you would need to go through them. But if it's going to affect 20 or more employees, you must make sure that you have employee representatives who are going to be your facing point, who you are going to consult with in relation to putting forward those proposed changes. And that number 20 is about deciding whether you are going to be dismissing and rehiring. So that is when you can't get agreement, where you have to serve notice, dismiss the employee and re-engage them. That is when that 20 will apply. You have a legal obligation to consult with those recognised trade unions and employee representatives if you are going to be hitting that number. And that process is called collective consultation. So again, it's about working together. If the employer, as I've already mentioned, if you don't have this collective consultation, you could be fined up to 90 days pay for each affected employee. So you can just do the maths. If you're talking about 3 months' wages for 20 or more employees, that's a hefty bill that you will have to pick up for getting it wrong. So it is really, really important to make sure that you have a look at those terms of employment to see what you can and can't do, and that will really guide you. And again, looking at those numbers. So even if an employer is not planning on making those potential 20 dismissals and rehiring and re-engagement, you can still go through collective consultation. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, because actually it has some benefits in doing that, because it will save you time, particularly if it actually turns out that you do have to go over that 20 mark, a 20 employee mark of dismissal and rehire. And again, it does help with the process in terms of agreeing that change. So the changes can be agreed verbally or in writing. So they don't always have to be in writing, but it's always best practice to make sure that any variation is in writing, and that makes sure that there is no misunderstandings, and it also helps to put a line in the sand to know when that variation actually started. Now, there are certain changes where there is a statutory requirement for you to put the changes in writing. So if the change relates to anything that must be in the employee's written terms of employment, their statement of terms, their employment contract, all the same thing, then the employer must notify the employee of the change in writing within 1 month of that change taking place. So for example, if the change is going to relate to a job title change, to a job description change, the job location change, whether it's going to affect pay, working hours, holiday entitlement, and whether there are any changes to collective agreements with trade unions, that is when you must put it in writing and you must notify the employee of that change within 1 month of it taking effect. Now, what impact is this going to have on the new requirements which came into force in April of 2020? Now, I know we were all, neck deep in trying to deal with, the implementation of furlough, and I'm sure that the new changes that have come into force have passed by many an employer. But if the employee's statement of terms were provided before 6th of April 2020 and there needs to be a change, you have to give the employee further information relating to the changes to their existing terms of employment. So the extra information that you will need to provide so that you comply with those new changes that took effect in April will include things about training. Is there any mandatory training that they need to go through, or if there is no training? If there is training, what is that training going to look like? How is it going to be provided? When is it going to be delivered? And information of that sort of nature. You would also need to include further information about additional leave entitlements. So at the moment, pre-6th of April, the leave entitlements was limited to annual leave and sick leave. After the 6th of April, that leave entitlement extends much further, which includes the statutory leave entitlement. So, for example, maternity leave, paternity leave, shared parental leave, etc., etc., etc. And again, the other requirement which you must provide further information on is if there are any additional benefits that the employee benefits from. So, for example, if you provide private medical, that needs to be included in the contract. There might be non-monetary benefits that you may provide to your employees. So, for example, you might have a platform that gives discounts, then you also need to include that information. So again, if there is going to be that variation of term and you do have to issue the new contract, do make sure that you include those additional requirements that have come in force since the 6th of April 2020. If you are unsure what those are, do get in contact with us and we'll help you and we will point you in the right direction to make sure that you comply with those new regulations. If an employer and an employee cannot agree on the change, the best approach is to keep talking, keep the conversation going for as long as possible, and make every effort to try and reach that compromise, try and reach that middle ground that's going to work for both parties, because it'll give you a further opportunity for you to understand your employee's point of view, from your employees to understand your point of view. You will have an opportunity to have a look at all options. Don't rush it. This is not a race. It's a journey that you're going to go through to make sure that you achieve that end goal that you need to achieve in the best possible way, following best practices. So again, it can help you when you're looking, as an employer. Have a look at your policies. Make sure that employees are aware of policies that you have. So, for example, if an employee feels that they have been unfairly treated, direct them to your grievance procedure so that they can raise a formal grievance as part of the process. So again, you can have a look at it from a fresh pair of eyes, perhaps from somebody who hasn't been involved with the variation of terms and the change of contractual terms. So again, do make sure that if there's no flexibility clause, changes cannot be agreed. An employer can still make those changes, but it's not without risk. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, because changing contracts of employment, changing variation of terms, varying those written statement of terms can be very complex. It's a complex legal matter. And I often hear organisations ringing in for help when they've tried to Google it. They've got some generic information and they've managed to get it wrong, and we are here end up helping them, get them out of that very, very deep hole. But do make sure that you follow those processes. Sometimes you might have gone through, you might have made those changes, you may have implemented those changes, you've gone through due process, you've had that discussion, you've had everything, but you might still have some employees who do not agree to those changes, and they choose to stay on temporarily, but they choose to work under protest. So what this means is they have flagged up to you to say, my employer, I do not agree to your proposed changes, but I am going to work to the new changes under protest until we can find a resolution. Now, that is normally for a very short period of time. The longer an employee continues to work to the new terms, the more the indication is that actually they have agreed to those terms. But if an employee is going to be, raising that flag to explain to you that they are working under protest, it is normally a highlight to an employer that they are considering their options and they may be considering taking legal action. So don't be fooled in thinking that if an employee is going to continue working, that it has all been accepted and we've brushed it under the carpet and we can move on, because it may not be the case. But again, as I say, if an employee is working under protest, they must make it clear to you, they must make it obvious to you that they are working under protest. And normally how this is received is you will normally find it in writing. If you are having an employee that just says, oh, I'm not going to be working to those terms, but doesn't follow it up, it could be that actually they're just having a complaint at that particular time, that actually they just not wanting to accept the change at that particular time, and then they do nothing, they continue to work. If they haven't put it in writing, if they haven't made it obvious to you, clear to make it to you, understanding that they are working under protest, you wouldn't be criticised for believing that they had actually accepted that change. But normally when an employee is working under protest, as I say, it comes in writing, and normally it will be on a regular basis. So at the end of every week, it will be a reminder that I'm working under protest, or the beginning of the next week, I'm working under protest, or every time they get paid. So that may well be weekly paid or monthly paid, fortnightly, or however you pay your employees. So if an employee does not notify you about their objections and start to work under those new terms, it's perfectly reasonable for you to believe that it may be seen that they are actually accepting those terms. So where a job has changed, if you're changing a job, again, this is one of the requirements where it has to be put in writing. So this may be a case where the job that they were doing when they originally joined the organisation, so it is a change of job to what their original agreement was. So for example, you might start off as a picker and a packer, and you've worked your way up, you've become a team leader, and you have now become a line manager. that is a change. So again, that change needs to be documented. It does need to be put in writing. And again, it may well be if you are changing a job within an organisation that may perhaps have completely different departments. So you may well have been in the warehouse and you have changed and you've gone into the admin department. So again, you are perhaps going from a physical job to a more admin desk-based job. That will be a change and that will be required to be put in writing. Even if there isn't a requirement to put it in writing, it's always a good idea to do it. It creates an audit trail and also it creates a point in time when that change has taken effect, rather than thinking, oh, it was on or about Christmas time we made those changes. You know, is quite difficult to deal with because you never know when it was. Whereas if you know it was on the 25th of a particular month, you know exactly when that change has taken place, rather than having to best guess. We always avoid best guessing. We like to have that clear understanding on when that change is going to take an effect. So even if you don't, you know, have it in writing, do remember that, you know, employment rights still continue. So even if there is nothing in writing, you know, your employees will still have certain employment rights and certain employment protections by law, but it is always best practice to have it in writing. Sometimes, as I've mentioned, an employee may want to change their terms of employment. So what happens if an employee asks to vary their terms and conditions of employment? And it might be a small change and it might be a big change. But if an employee wants to make a change, you must get the employer's consent and agreement to doing that first. So if an employee is going to be coming to you wanting to make that change, do bear in mind that the variation that they are seeking might actually trigger a flexible working request. And there are certain circumstances where a flexible working request the employee is entitled to it by law, and you do have to follow that flexible working request process. In certain cases, it may not apply to a flexible working request, but always try and understand, talk openly and honestly with your employee to try and understand why they need to make the change, so you can consider their point of view, and you can again try and meet that middle ground to compromise, to try and agree it. Again, if there's a trade union involved, then it is best practice to get them involved in those sorts of discussions. So do, you know, if an employee does come to you, do have a look to see whether they are triggering that flexible working request, which is a legal process in its own right and is separate to a variation of terms. So again, just having a look at it and making sure that you follow the correct process. So of course, if you agree to those changes, it'll be agreed in writing. It'll be a change to those written terms of employment, and the employee will be updated with a revised copy of their terms of employment within 1 month. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about a flexible working request. That's a webinar for another day. But again, an employer does not need to agree to any changes that an employee has put forward. So let's move on. I'm quite conscious of where we are in time, so let's move on quite swiftly to have a look how you can make those changes, how to change those terms of employment. So the very, very, very first starting point is be clear about the reasons why you want to make the change. Make sure that the changes that you are trying to implement are supported by a genuine business reason. If there is not a genuine business reason, your whole process is bound to fail. You are bound to fall short, and you are bound to find yourself in trouble. So make sure that you are clear about the reasons. Make sure that there is a genuine business reason to do so. Think about the process that you are going to be following. Make sure that the process is planned. Understand how long it's going to take. Understand whether you need to go into collective consultation. So again, it's not something that should be done in a flash in a pan. It should not be hurried. It should not be rushed. Take your time about it, because making sure that you have that plan in place Really early on, you will be able to identify any issues that you may encounter as you go along, and you will be able to put in place measures. Once you've got a plan in place, make sure that it is flexible, make sure that it is agile, so that if anything is given to you and you are provided with some solutions by employees, you can give it meaningful consultation, you can give it meaningful consideration without the pressure of having this clock ticking that you have to get this done before a particular time. So again, make sure you plan what that process is going to be, and you have a timetable. But whilst you have that timetable, make sure that it is flexible and you can be agile. Check to see whether or not there is an obligation to consult collectively, particularly if this will arise if you are going to end up dismissing employees and re-engaging them, and understanding what impact this will have on your timetable. So again, bearing in mind some employees might have 12 weeks notice that you need to provide them before you can re-engage them, in which case you need to factor that into it. So again, bear all of that in mind. Make sure that you check the employee's history. Check to see if they have been subject to a 2P transfer, because it may be more difficult to implement the change. So again, you might need to do something differently for those employees who are subject to a 2P transfer. Do take the time to have a look at an employee's contract of employment to make sure that you have the clauses required authorising the changes, and be aware of the limitations. So you might have a clause in the contract, but it might be limiting in what you can and what you can't do. So be fully aware of what you can, what you can't do, what you're authorised to and what you're not authorised to. And make sure that you differentiate between what is a contractual change and what is a non-contractual change. So again, contractual is what is in your terms of employment. Non-contractual may well be what's in the handbook. But just because it may impact a non-contractual policy, you do have to be mindful that it may not impact on the contractual terms. And I'll refer you to a case in a moment when I talk about that. So it's looking at everything holistically. Take a bird's eye view, have a look at it, to see if anything is going to impact anything else that you have in the contract. So it's not always so straightforward. And again, also make sure that you always act reasonably. I can't emphasize it enough. Any process that an employer goes through, an employment tribunal judge will always have a look to see whether you acted fairly and reasonably throughout the process. So again, it's another reminder that you do need to be fair and reasonable. Do keep in mind that in obtaining the employee's express consent is always the best way to go. When you've got that agreement, it is so much easier than when you're forcing that change through. And do ensure that changes are for the right reasons, and make sure that employees are aware of what the reasons are. You can communicate that to them, have that open and honest conversation with them, explain to them the justification, what that genuine business reason is. Excuse me. Consider whether you need to dismiss and re-engage an employee if they do not consent to that change. So do consider what the options are that are available to you if you do not get that consent, if you do not get that agreement. And again, make sure that you consult appropriately with either the employee representative or with the trade union. I do apologise, my voice has gone on me. I seem to have choked a little bit, and it has affected my voice. So I do apologise. I will try and speak a little bit louder so that you can at least hear what I'm saying. So again, do make sure that when you are going through the collective consultation, and if it is going down the process where you may need to have those dismissal and re-engagement discussions with individuals, you hold individual one-to-one discussions with those who are being affected. So again, it's still really important that you do have that one-to-one discussion with the employee before you go ahead and make those the decision to dismiss and re-engage. So again, also make sure that you give the employees the required notice that they require for any variation. So again, it might be, contractual. If it is more, if statutory is more than contractual, statutory will trump any contractual notice. So if, for example, an employee has been with you for 12 years, they would be entitled to 12 weeks notice. If the contract only allows for 1 month's notice, the 12 weeks will trump that. So again, you need to be aware of any notice periods that you may need to deal with. And then, of course, when you are offering new contracts to employees, make sure it contains the new revised terms. So what can you do when an employee refuses to agree to those changes? So we've already understood that an employee can work under a protest, they can work under duress. But if an employee refuses, an employer and agreement can't be reached, an employer might decide to dismiss and re-engage. In other words, you serve notice on the existing terms of employment and you rehire them on the new terms under the new contract of employment. This absolutely must be the last resort, and it must only be after there has been proper, meaningful consultation. But before you go through that, do think, before you force that change through, is ask yourself, have I done absolutely everything I possibly can to try and reach an agreement? Ask yourself again, are these changes absolutely necessary? Do I have to put them through? Ask yourself, what is the risk on employee engagement and staff morale in forcing this change through? And ask yourself, what is the risk of legal action? What are the risks I'm putting my organization through? If you've answered all those questions and you still feel that, dismissal, serving notice for dismissal and re-engagement is still the only option, then of course go through that. But that still needs to go through a proper procedure. If deciding to dismiss and rehire, you must make sure that you still follow a fair dismissal procedure. Make sure that you give the employee notice, and as I've already mentioned, statutory notice or contract, whichever is the greater. And you must make sure that the employee has the right to appeal. Changes must not take place until the employee has been fairly dismissed and then rehired. So don't think you can impose those changes during that notice period. You have to wait until you have gone through that period of notice. So in certain circumstances, you might need to wait 3 months, 12 weeks before you can actually implement that change. So again, when you're looking at those changes, make sure you are aware of that. Look at the timescales to make sure that you don't fall foul of implementing those changes prematurely. And again, it won't have an impact on an employee's length of service. By dismissing and re-engaging the employees, continuous employment will be preserved. So it will remain as their original start date, even though you've gone through that dismissal and re-engagement process. So there are, of course, risks for employers who dismiss and rehire. So an employee, if they feel that they have been unfairly dismissed, they may make a claim to an employment tribunal. They must, of course, have more than 2 years service before they can make a claim. I've already mentioned it. If there are 20 or more employees that are being dismissed and rehired, you may face legal action if you do not hold that collective consultation with any recognised trade union or employee representatives. And as I've mentioned before, an employer can be fined up to 90 days' wages for each affected employee, which is quite significant. So if you are considering doing this, do think of the impact, think about the consequences that may arise, and I would strongly advise you to get advice on doing it. Get that advice, get that support to make sure that you are kept on the right side of the law. When forcing changes, it might break a contract. So an employer might be breaking a contract terms of employment conditions if you change it without the flexibility clause in the contract. So that would be a breach of contract claim. So that would be an additional claim that an employee would be entitled to bring if you are doing something that the contract does not allow for it. So if there is no variation clause and you go through with it, it will be a breach of contract claim as well as a potentially unfair dismissal claim. And again, if you dismiss and rehire an employee without giving the correct notice, so again, not giving that notice would be a breach of contract claim. So again, and it could lead to legal action. Forcing a change without discussion or agreement could lead to disputes. It could lead to a lower level of engagement. It could actually have a negative impact on performance in the workplace. And of course, you will be having employees that may be working under protest. So again, if there has been a breach of contract, an employee can make a claim against an employer not only in the employment tribunals, but they can also make a claim for damages in a civil court. So your normal magistrates court, they could take you to court there. So in the employment tribunal, potentially, you know, if it's related to pay, you could expose yourself to an unlawful deduction from wages claim. And of course, there is always the risk of constructive unfair dismissal claims. So again, if the breach is fundamental and the employee has felt that they have been left with no other choice but to leave their job, and they may be entitled to constructive unfair dismissal claims. So again, you know, it is not without risk forcing those changes through, but if it is done correctly, if it is done properly, you know, you can still get through it and be successful in defending any such claim. Always try and reach a compromise. If you can't agree those proposed changes, best practice is to keep talking, keep engaged with the employees, try and find an arrangement that's going to work for both of you. You know, the more you discuss it, the more likely you are to find a resolution in between. But of course, discussions can't go on forever, and there does come a point in time where you need to draw a line. So let's have a quick look at what are the risks to employers, what are the pitfalls to avoid, and to help me put this into context, I'm going to have a look at a couple of cases where it looks fairly straightforward, but the cases that I'm going to have a look at is where the employer has been successfully sued by employees following attempts to change their terms and conditions of employment. So do make sure that you must have the necessary strategic thinking, the solid business rationale, the genuine business reason for the change. Those changes can be implemented, but I am going to just talk you through a couple of examples where they are really just reminders on some traps that may be lurking there where you may not be seeing them. So first of all, the first sort of key point is making sure that only clear and unambiguous variation words will do. So making sure that your variation provisions within your contract are clear, they are unambiguous, they are not open to interpretation, they are very, very clear on what they are. And this was highlighted in a case called Hart versus St Mary's School, and Norman and others versus the National Audit Office. And in these two cases, the Employment Tribunal, Appeal Tribunal, considered whether or not the employees concerned were able to rely on, the employers were able to rely on the terms in their contractual terms to vary the terms of employment of the employees. So in the first case, Mrs. Hart was a teaching assistant, and they wanted to impose changes to part-time working hours. Now, in her contract of employment, she had a provision which said words to the effect that she would be required to work such times as necessary in the reasonable opinion of the head teacher for the proper performance of her duties. Now, we've all got that in our contracts, we've all got that. But her contract went one step further, and there was a further clause that said part-time staff working hours may be subject to variation depending on the requirement of the school timetable. In the second case of the National Audit Office, it was where the National Audit Office wished to reduce the entitlement to sick pay, so sick leave. and they imposed the change without consulting their trade union. And they relied on a clause which said, words to the effect, detailed particulars of conditions of service are found in the relevant sections of the HR manual of the Audit Office. And these are subject to change at reasonable notice. In both cases, the Employment Tribunal found that the variation clauses were insufficient, they were unclear, and they were unambiguous. The ability to vary the terms were potentially onerous on the employee, and as such, they found in favour of the employees. So again, even if there are these clauses in a contract of employment, you do need to have a look at them and maybe go a little bit further to make sure that you don't simply rely on what is in the contract, specifically what it is. Go further. And this is where consultation, discussing, engaging and working with your employees goes so much further. So again, you know, having a look, don't assume that changes to a handbook provisions will make it easier. You know, we've already identified, you know, that referring to a handbook, you know, maybe contractual, non-contractual provisions might be all encompassed in a policy, referring to something that is in the contract. And again, in the case of Sparks and another against the Department for Transport, wanted to make a change to their sickness absence policy. The sickness absence policy was in their handbook. And the policy itself contained a clause to provide reassurance that you know, contracts of employment terms would not be changed, which would be a detriment to the employees. Lo and behold, when this was in tribunal, it was found that the introduction of a new trigger point in the handbook had a consequential impact of the trigger point which was contained in the contract, and the trigger point had a detrimental impact on the particular employee. So of course it came as perhaps a surprise, but on reflection it is no surprise that the employee actually won on that particular case. So you know, it's a clear reminder to employers to make sure that they are very clear as to which handbook provisions are going to have an intended contractual knock-on effect. More often than not, it is an unintentional consequential impact. But again, when you are looking to make a change, look at everything. As I said earlier on, take that holistic view. Look at the contract, look at the handbook, look at custom and practice, look at everything before you force that change through. So again, you know, having a strategy when changing terms and conditions is absolutely key. The key points to remember is it's not simply enough to point to a contractual point which allows you to vary those terms. That is just the beginning. That is just the starting point. It doesn't matter how well drafted the contractual variation terms might be. Employers must still be cautious, and even if it is clear and unambiguous, and you couldn't get any clearer, do make sure that you cater for all situations and you don't try and pigeonhole it. You know, and make sure that you have a look at you know, much broader and from a holistic point of view. Strategic changing terms of employment must have careful planning. You know, planning is absolutely key. A tactical decision to be made whether or not to downplay minor changes versus, you know, major changes. You know, the key thing is be open, honest, consult with your employees, explain to them everything that you're going to be doing. I always believe you know, having that open and transparency, having those difficult conversations, be transparent, share as much information that you need to ensure that you get employees on board, understanding the reasons why you need to go through the process that you're going through. Best practice is talking to employees. You'll be in a far better position to defend any potential claims. You'll be in a far better position to get that agreement, and you will limit those exposures to your organisation. So, you know, I think I've covered everything in terms of variation of terms. You know, please, as I say at every end of every webinar, don't get it wrong. You know, getting it wrong can be costly. You know, it will be stressful. It's time consuming having to defend ET claims. You know, there is help there. You know, don't try and do it on your own. Don't try and, you know, think, oh, I can do this. Help is on hand. We're always here to help you. You can get in contact with us through our website, you know, through the contact us form. Just as a quick reminder, it's www.hrforuk.com. You can contact us through our telephone number, which is 01455 444 222, or you can drop us an email at info@hrforuk.com, and we will be there to help you and guide you through this. Don't forget, this is a journey that you're going to go through. Don't rush it through, and don't compromise that all-important employee-employer relationship. As always, you know, we have got packages that can help you. We have moved from our coronavirus crisis package to a business crisis package. It doesn't matter what situation your business is in. We are here to be able to help you. Make sure that you ensure that you keep on the right side of the law. Help is at hand. Please don't try and struggle on your own, because struggling on your own is only going to add to the problems that we are currently facing. So I do hope you have found today's webinar helpful and useful. As I said, there's no live Q&As today, so I do apologise for anybody who has joined in late and didn't hear that there weren't going to be Q&As. I will collate all those questions that have come in. I will make sure that the package comes out to you and you will get a recording of this. So thank you very much, everybody. As always, I've gone over my time slot, but can I wish you a lovely weekend? I'm not too sure what the weather's going to do, but whatever you are going to do, have a fantastic time. And for those of you who've got a bank holiday weekend, enjoy Monday off, and I will see you again at our next webinar, which is on the 11th of September. We are now going into bi-weekly webinars, and I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care, stay safe, and bye for now.